Globalization is free trade driven. And there's a very famous quote from Friedrich August von Hayek, the Nobel laureate from the Austrian School of Economics, who said, if goods don't cross borders, armies will.
What does China try to achieve in these decades and in this century?
Industrial growth is a very important geostrategic asset.
What types of good is China exporting to the United States? Is it important stuff like food or industrial goods that you need for defense? Or is it more on the retail consumption side of things?
Trade wars don't make matters easier, and they will just increase the risks of having real political geostrategic conflicts and kinetic wars.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 6th episode of the Odyssey Believe in Something podcast. In the past episodes, we've discussed the role and developments of the Tariff Wars that we are currently witnessing and that are shaking up the global economy a bit. And today we are joined by Tuna, having high expertise in everything concerning China and Austrian economics. We will explore the role of China in the trade war and get a better understanding of this very relevant party in that conflict, which in most media outlets is vastly underrepresented and understood very little. Maybe to start, Tuna, do you want to give us a brief background about your China expertise and how you found interest in that topic?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to talk to you, as always. The word expertise on China is a bit hardcore, I would guess, because expertise on a whole country is very hard to gain. But I studied China studies, and I'm working in the political Berlin, as we call it here. So I work for different associations concerned with industry interests, finance interests, and I have some experience of talking to politicians and doing regular political communications and public affairs work.
Is there a lot of discussion in the political Berlin about the trade war right now? Maybe especially with a Chinese angle to it?
Actually, there is a huge discussion about this, but as I feel it's mostly underrepresented that Trump has a very, very deep long-run plan. People just see the damages of the tariffs and only complain about it. Some more superficial people always talk about Trump is crazy and stuff, but when you look on it from a macroeconomic perspective and also by understanding Austrian economics and monetary policies, you can see that there is maybe a bit more underneath the whole media drama. We all know that Trump likes reality shows and does politics as if it is a reality show.
Yeah, I fully agree with the claim that most reporting about the tariffs unfolding in popular media is very shallow, and there's not a lot of attention devoted to the at least possibility that there might be a strategy behind all of this. The very frequent pivoting in terms of imposing new tariffs, then pausing them, of course, puts into question the claim that, okay, there is a clear and a concise strategy behind it. But if you think that there is, would you mind explaining how you think the aims of Trump are looking like?
Yeah. You have to take Trump literally by what he says. Make America great again is his plan. So he wants to maintain the superpower status of the United States and therefore also maintain the reserve currency status of the US dollar. In the long run, if the neoliberal system, which came after the Bretton Woods system, goes on, the whole world will develop much faster than the United States, which will lead to the United States becoming relatively smaller to the rest of the world. So I think it would help many people understanding Trump's foreign policies and economic policies to take him literally when he talks about make America great again as a superpower and also the reciprocity of the tariff.
Do you think that Trump is on a path of achieving that goal right now? Do you think that the tariffs are helping? And maybe also to find the way over to the geopolitical angle with the economic and potential world dominance rivalry with China that has been developing over the past couple of years. How do you think the tariffs play into that?
The geopolitical standpoint from the United States is very easy. It's to maintain its superpower status, so therefore maintaining its military bases abroad, the military bases where the allied countries are, all NATO countries like Germany, but also other countries like Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. And therefore, I guess this is one part of the policies. Also Taiwan plays a very important role because the whole East China and South China Sea doesn't have access to international waters. So China doesn't have the possibility to easily maneuver around American dominance into the Pacific. And it was also in the Second World War, and after that, always a huge geostrategic target of the United States to secure the Pacific Ocean. What is important about the whole issue of industrialization and deindustrialization, which is discussed right now, is not that only the Rust Belt workers want to give their protest votes to Trump. There's also a very important geostrategic aspect to supply chains and to industry, because when there's a war or there's a potential for a war, an arms race needs a huge stock of capital. So you have to have a long record of accumulating capital for your economy and industrial goods and industrial capacities to organize a war economy if there is a war coming. Industrial growth, not only economic growth, but industrial growth is a very important geostrategic asset.
So we've established that for the sake of geopolitical resilience, it makes sense to reshore one or the other industry. However, since we've seen a rather broad implementation, or at least the on and off threat of implementing these tariffs, also against geopolitical allies of the United States, which are Canada, Japan, South Korea, and most of the EU, so the entire NATO countries. Do you see any objective in there? Do you see any point in also targeting political allies with these tariffs?
When you look to the political allies of the United States, they are also not very free trade. We also have many tariffs and non-tariffary trade barriers. That's a huge issue for American industry and economy. And the neoliberal reforms by Thatcher and Reagan were due to the long run belief that everyone will understand the benefits of free trade and will therefore deregulate their customs, their tariffs, their non-tariffary barriers, and so on. But when we look how bureaucracy and regulations grew since the 70s, it's enormous. So it's very understandable that uh, there is a huge critique from the United States to the rest of the world. When you talk about the reciprocity part of what Trump says, it's understandable. You can't only point to Trump, you also have to look on yourself. There's a very famous German professor, the former president of the IFO Institute, Hans Werner Sinn, who also pointed this out. Trump putting on tariffs is not great for the US as well, but we shouldn't be too fast to criticize Trump without seeing our own issues we imposed on the trade with the US. It's astonishing that until 2016, when TTIP was criticized by NGOs, climate activists, and all other sorts of activist groups. And there was a huge outrage against free trade and against deregulation or harmonization of regulation. But now, out of a sudden, when Trump comes around and put tariffs on trade, everyone becomes a free trade advocate.
I find that quite entertaining too, that all the people who went on the streets and barricades against TTIP are now suddenly the defenders of free trade and the free market. Maybe to dive deeper into the role of China, how resilient or how fragile do you view the Chinese economy and society right now? Are they going to be the ones who suffer from the tariffs, or is it okay, they can just sit back, relax, enjoy the chaos in the Western world, all of these Western allies having to sort these conflicts out between each other, and might they even come out as the winner from all of this?
That's a very, very hard question to answer. But what we can say is that the high tariffs will create a demand shock. So there are huge supply chains from China to the US which don't have demand in the US market because the US market is huge. This will impact China very harshly because most of China's industry is designed to supply foreign consumption. So, of course, it will harm China very much, but it will also harm the US consumer side because they won't have their cheap products. There are also many Chinese companies who still won't produce in the US due to uncertainty and due to very high costs in the US. It's very hard in the US to produce cheap. And this is the comparative advantage of China, highly skilled labor for a cheap price. I guess both sides will lose, but as it looks right now, China will lose more because they are much more export oriented.
What types of good is China exporting to the United States? Is it important stuff like food or industrial goods that you need for defense, or is it more on the retail consumption side of things where it is nice for the US consumer to have access to these cheap goods, but it does not create any essential necessity or real world value in the day-to-day lives of
Consumption goods, of course, create real value in day to day life. The comparative advantage of China is in easy manufacturable goods, labor intensive and easy to manufacture goods, mostly consumption goods. And this will impact the US American consumers very much. It's more retail products which will get harmed by this tariff. But the dependence on China is a complicated issue. Most people say we are dependent on China because the trade is so huge. But when you actually look into it, there are just very, very few things on which economies or supply chains are really dependent on China when you go into detail. And there's a study from the EFW Kiel where they said there's less than 1% dependency of industrial production from China. As we know, entrepreneurship is always able to substitute stuff you are dependent on. There's always an imperfect substitute, and there's never a perfect substitute, of course, but you can always find an imperfect substitute. So this dependency argument from China is wrong. I think this is just instrumentalized to argue for tariffs or for more autarky or to strengthen their own industry against foreign trade, against a free foreign trade.
Do you personally see a necessity for more autarky with the geopolitical tensions rising over the past couple of years?
Of course
Or
not.
maybe to expand that question even further, do you personally think that globalization, as we have seen it from the 1990s to 2020, has peaked? Or is this just a temporary cool down?
That's also hard to answer. As it seems right now, it has peaked already and is going back right now, but we still don't know how the new world order which Trump is building will look like. There is potential for more globalization, but then there has to be the political will in many, if not all, countries on the world to have free trade. Globalization is free trade driven. And there's a very famous quote from Friedrich August von Hayek, the Nobel laureate from the Austrian School of Economics, who said, if goods don't cross borders, armies will. The problem in the 19 was that many countries seek to have more autarky and made these Keynesian policies to increase demand and stimulate the economy. And this led to more discrimination of foreign products, more tariffs, and so on. And free markets were criticized. Free markets were not liked by the masses and the politicians. There were huge initiatives for more autarky in the economies, which led to the economic problems of the 30s and deepened the depression. When many countries react with retaliation to Trump's tariffs, this will be a huge catastrophe for world economy. And therefore, a very positive signal from Ursula von der Leyen is that she made statements to Trump that the EU is able to lower tariffs if the US also doesn't impose tariffs on European trade. But again, why isn't it possible to make a free trade agreement like with Canada? But now, out of a sudden, when there's the threat of tariffs, everyone wants to lower tariffs. That's a whole homemade problem, and it's a long run consequence that Trump or someone like Trump comes around and makes a reality show out of politics and imposes tariffs.
No, no, I agree with a lot of the things you said there, especially the people fearing a large scale recession or crash of the economy. I think it is overblown to the extent that, contrary to crises we've had in the past, where we've had financial over-engineering in the 2008-09 housing bubble, or where we've had a global shock to all supply chains during the COVID era of 2020 to 2022. This is an entirely man-made conflict we have right now.
Yes.
We can make it worse. We can also solve it pretty easily. There's no physical necessity to let this spiral into escalation. On that note, since you mentioned the quote that if goods don't cross borders, armies will, if we foresee a less globalized world, do you think that the risk of kinetic war between the West and China or the West and Russia is rising? Or do you see that we're in some sort of a pat situation where nothing really moves, but these geopolitical tensions will just continue to exist?
Yeah, again, it's very hard to foresee the future, but the risk of a kinetic war will rise, of course. That's a problem. Trade wars don't make matters easier, and they will just increase the risks of having real political geostrategic conflicts and then, in the end, kinetic wars. I see that risk, and therefore I hope that there will be reasonable politicians who will understand the interests of the United States and will be open to reasonable solutions and pragmatic solutions which benefit their mutual interests, instead of just going around and telling the media that Trump is crazy.
Do you think there is a path to the tariffs leading to reindustrialization, and that reindustrialization in the West actually strengthening the country's resilience in the mid to long run, which then in turn would increase the deterrence to even escalate any existing geopolitical conflict with these nations, so that we would, instead of a mutually assured destruction from a nuclear standpoint, which we've had during the Cold War, we would create deterrence through economic resilience and through defense resilience overall. Do you see that as a likely outcome, or do you think the West will be so fractured in the short to midterm by the distortion of these existing economic relations that it will weaken most of these nations?
That would be my hope, that economic growth and economic strength will lead to deterrence of war. Only a hope, because it's very hard to foresee how politicians will act. And it was economically very clear that TTIP would have benefited not only the US, but also the Europeans, especially Germany, because Germany is very export oriented. But it wasn't possible to politically communicate this, and there were huge outrages against this. So I guess that reasonable economic policies are hard to do because many people don't understand the counterintuitive economic measures which are needed in critical times like this. There's a risk that it won't happen, but from the perspective of the Austrian School of Economics, the solution is easy. Deregulation, liberalization of markets, and lower taxes. Because when the costs of exports are artificially higher due to tariffs, then I can lower the costs of production just by the same amount by deregulation and by lowering taxes or energy prices, which are artificially high, especially in Germany. So, I mean, economically, from a macro perspective, it's always easy to make such suggestions, but finding the right politicians at the right time with the right stakeholders who are for this economic policies, that's the hard one. And Thomas Sowell always said, all these economic theories are simple, but it's not easy to do. That's the problem. That's a huge risk factor which creates this economic uncertainty.
You brought up a lot of good points there. Maybe since you've hinted on the new global trade order that Trump would like to create, and there have been theses around Mar-a-Lago Accords that should be the successor of Bretton Woods and prior economic agreements. From the perspective of Trump, if you had the entire creative authority to design that new global trade order, how would you design it from a perspective of the United States and the West? And then maybe to shift that perspective, how would you try to design it from China's perspective?
My design would be the same for either China or the US, because it's the same solution which I just pointed out, which would be the reasonable outcome if someone imposes tariffs. It's deregulation, lowering taxes, and lowering costs of production for industry and trade. It's very counterintuitive, but when you look on tax revenues, the actual tax revenues don't really change in the long run, no matter how high the tax rates are. And people usually confuse the height of the tax rates with the real amount of tax revenue. So that's the essential problem. And when you say, for example, tax and social security and state social security quote of like 50%, it slows down growth and slows down the relative amount of greatness the German economy could have. But when you lower it to 10%, the economy would be asymmetrically bigger, but the 10% would still create so much revenue that you would be able to invest in the equal amount of strategic assets for military deterrence and to project your military power. Actually, liberalization and a very minarchistic state is the best solution for military deterrence and for power projection. And that's the thing I would suggest for everyone, because when the United States does that, the United States are a huge economy. If they deregulate more and if the costs get lower without tariffs or anything else, of course there will be more production, more entrepreneurship, and more goods. And the capital accumulation gets so much higher that you have so much supply chains that you can use this supply chains to help your military economy as well. And when there's a war, you always have it easier to use all those supply chains to reallocate into a war economy. This is what makes industrial warfare so industry driven, which is why supply chains are so important.
From a Chinese perspective, if you put yourself in the shoes of Xi Jinping, obviously leading a highly totalitarian state and pursuing a government model that is diametrically opposed to a free trade order, at least in a domestic sense. How would you respond as the Chinese government, and how would you try to direct your Chinese population through the current state of affairs?
I mean, it was pointed out oftentimes in the past that China has to increase its own consumption because most of the industry is for export. And actually, the problem with foreign trade surpluses is that you hurt your own economy. Because when you look what it really does, is you are giving away the goods and services you produce and gain dollar bills, which are inflated away in the long run. You have huge foreign assets, which you can't bring back to your own country because your currency will appreciate so much that your exports will go down again. We have this foreign assets, which without interest and without real control over it, because no one can buy such amounts of foreign assets. So what I would do as China is, as I said, the same, deregulate and look that the own economy can profit from the own goods and services the economy produces without subsidizing foreign trade by imposing taxes or costs on the own economy. That would be my solution. But I don't know whether China understands this. Also in China, many people always say China is an authoritarian country, which might be true. But when you look on the whole Chinese system, China is a very huge country. It rules over about 1/6 of humanity. And the area of China is comparable to the landmass of China is comparable to the United States. When you look at Chinese history for the last couple of thousand years, the emperors and the rulers always had the same problem of controlling the local authorities. It is impossible to rule the whole country centrally. I mean, it gets easier year by year by economic development and by technological innovation. But you still have the issue that there are more than 7,000 local governments with their own authorities, with their own ministries, and they're all competing with each other to get promoted within the party and within the state ranks to get better positions. When you look on the local authorities, they are in a competitive state with other local authorities to gain the attention of the central government and to gain subsidies. So the vast amount of competition China creates and the innovation comes from this. It doesn't come from a free market because the free market is still not very free there. It's very state dependent on local authorities which are competing with each other. China scholars usually call this fragmented authoritarianism, which means that local government are in competition with each other for the attention of the central government due to being not able to finance themselves, but being dependent on subsidies from the central government. And also the authorities within the local government are competing with each other. So that creates so much competition that the state produces some innovation, but it's also very inefficient because when out of a sudden there's a 5-year plan and it says we need more production of climate neutral energy sources, out of a sudden everywhere there are industrial parks which produce solar panels, like what happened 10 or 15 years ago. And they produce overcapacities which are inefficient. So it's the same issue in China like everywhere. You need to liberalize the market and have strong private property laws and lower taxes and have security inside the country and have a very stable rule of law. That's the very important thing.
To draw more on your understanding of Chinese culture and the system there, how would you contextualize the objectives of China for the 21st century? What does China try to achieve in these decades and in this century?
China first wants to keep the rule of the Communist Party within China. That's the most important political target, and that's what everything is built around. Then in 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, they want to be a great international power again. So they are working towards this. This is one political target. And domestically, which is highly neglected by most people, Communist Party of China is still a communist party. They still believe in socialism. They still advocate very harsh state control of the economy. And it's only by government fiat that on a small level businesses and entrepreneurs are allowed. But when you grow beyond a certain level, they always want state control or party influence within those companies. So that's a very important issue which people neglect, as far as I know. It's very important to point out that the target for the long run communism or socialism is still there. Also, China calls it socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's a very common term for this. By putting some market aspects within the socialism, but still trying to reach some sort of socialism. We know from the criticism against socialism from the last 150 years and the problem socialism created that this is not possible, but they try it anyway.
Do you think that the ignorance of the consequences of socialism will ultimately lead to the failure of China to rise towards becoming a new global power of equivocal power to the US?
I mean, we see it right now. Since the 90s, the growth rates are still high, but they're slowly declining because of more government control and more government intervention. I mean, I understand that a government needs to control the own population, and if there's only one party rule, that they have to control public media and stuff, but there's no necessity to control every aspect of industry and trade. Even if you have the political opinion of China that you want to preserve the rule of the Communist Party, it would be wise for them to have more liberal markets and more private property for the middle class so that the economy can strengthen itself. Because government intervention always fails in the long run and creates other problems which can't be solved entrepreneurially.
Would you say that the Chinese economy is more fragile than many people in the West assume, and that they'll ultimately be the ones who bear the majority of the costs from that entire trade war unfolding?
Yes, that I would agree with that statement. You don't know what reforms they will pursue after this kind of shock, but when they go on like this, and when they don't liberalize the economy and change the long run policies, I guess the economy of China will have massive problems. They already had massive problems due to the COVID lockdowns. I don't think it got that much better. But in the long run, you always need to have free markets, private property, and entrepreneurship, and you shouldn't overtax them or overregulate them because that's the only thing that produces wealth and growth.
I fully agree with that. But do you think that there is a realistic chance that the spark of this trade war actually leads to an economic and political liberalization of China domestically? Or do you think it is more likely that the CCP will cling onto its current control and influence, and that China will continue to suffer from these domestic problems, and that maybe a military expansionist path might be their only option left to preserve and increase their global influence?
It's hard to say again. What my feeling is about this is that political systems have a hard time to reform themselves. We saw it in Argentina. It took so many years, so many decades of poverty, of destroying their own economy until people realize that socialism and government intervention doesn't work. And there's still huge critics within Argentina, and huge demonstrations against the liberalization, but I mean, the effects are clear. It works. It's so easy. It's very, very easy economically. But people just don't want to understand it because it is very counterintuitive. And the same will apply to every country on the world. You also have to see it from the perspective of a politician. I mean, they also need to justify themselves to their coworkers, to their stakeholders, and to the people who believe in them. And they have to do something which people believe in. So it's also for them hard to do. I don't want to be in the position of Chinese politicians, which will have a very hard time. I don't know what the outcomes will be, but the necessary solutions and the necessary policies for good solutions are clear, in my opinion, from an Austrian perspective.
That wraps it up very nicely. I think there's a clear path to success for all economies and world nations you have outlined here in the past 30 minutes. Thank you very much for all of your insights. I think we've had a lot of signal relative to noise in this episode, because you've been very direct and very concise in what you would do in the position of any of these players. Thank you very much for joining, Tuna. To wrap up, is there any point of contact where people can reach you if they would like to learn more?
They can contact me via LinkedIn. I'm very happy for contacts and for conversations on China and world economy.
Cool. We'll make sure to link your LinkedIn in the podcast show notes. Other than that, thanks a lot for joining, and see you in the next episode.
Thank you very much.